It's hard to believe that the 2022 SDG Action Zone is almost over. But one of the joys of nearing the end of these 3 incredible days is getting to hear the thought leaders and changemakers we respect reflect on the standout moments. Who better to have that conversation than someone who was instrumental in setting the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including the Sustainable Development Goals? We're honored to have her with us, UN Deputy Secretary General Amina J. Mohammed. And joining the DSG to highlight his key takeaways and consider where we go from here is an Australian humanitarian who, as co-founder of Global Citizen, has received international praise for his work mobilizing resources to reduce extreme poverty in developing countries and advancing the SDGs. I'm delighted to welcome UN Deputy Secretary General Amina J. Mohammed in conversation with the CEO of Global Citizen, Hugh Evans.
Hi Hugh, welcome back to the UN.
Thank you so
It's great
much.
to see you after we have been away Zooming and teaming for so long, and now we get to be together. It's all, in person, and we've got hundreds of people in our halls. But today we get a chance to talk to you about the work that you've been doing with us, mobilizing the world behind our global goals, making a global citizen out of everyone, and that's been tough, I imagine, in the last couple of years where we have been so, would it be disconnected, yet very much connected online. So last 2-3 years, what have been your thoughts and how are we doing?
Well, it's interesting, Amina, and firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today, and thank you to everyone at the United Nations. When the pandemic first struck, my initial reaction was just, in addition to the terrible health consequences, I actually thought existentially for Global Citizen, because the festival was not going to happen in Central Park anymore. I was thinking, okay, what on earth do we do? And it was actually a few days later when Dr. Tedros called and said, could we mobilize young people around the world through One World Together at Home to start getting people in the virtual environment to start taking action, that I started to see how the model that we'd built in the real world that you were so instrumental in for so many years could actually go online, at least for the short term. It was interesting. There was this period where for a moment, everyone was prepared to go online. And that's when One World Together at Home mobilized $127 million for the World Health Organization, and Lady Gaga really championed that. And then there was this period of Zoom fatigue where no one wanted to go online anymore. And we started to see that had a huge effect on how people were engaging in action taking. But what we've seen now, which is really encouraging, is coming to the tail end of the first phase of the pandemic, we're now seeing that action taking is up like never before. In fact, this year in Central Park, where our actions are up 60-70% over last year, which is phenomenal. It just shows that people are willing to re-engage with the world again. And so I think while it was okay to go online temporarily, then when people became fatigued by that and weren't really willing to engage, it's now amazing that the real world engagement has driven up action taking like never before.
And that's really important because, again, here we come, we're back together again, connecting online as much fatigue as we got. We reached audiences everywhere. Where we wouldn't have actually done so on the ground. And now they're the same audiences that you talk about that are igniting this. We've got a number of crises. I mean, it started with how do we build back better from COVID?
Right.
Really difficult, mostly a socioeconomic challenge. Then we had the climate crisis that became more evident, more extreme, and then catastrophe of all catastrophes, we had the war in Ukraine. And we're dealing with all of these things, and yet we're having so much giving. Where are the areas that you're seeing there's the most giving to?
Well, it's really interesting because you're right. When the world is faced by a confluence of crises, how do you get mind share? Because, COVID-19 obviously pushed everyone to global health, and then the war in Ukraine pushed everyone towards refugees, and then now the climate crisis, as you say, is looming, and the United States is still lagging so far behind other donor countries in terms of its commitment to fulfilling the Paris Climate Change Accord. What we're finding these days is, particularly amongst young people, that climate and gender are the two biggest motivators. So all of our data that we're seeing from young global citizens around the world is that the climate crisis and fighting for gender equity are the two most enlivening SDGs, the ones that get them out of bed and make them go, okay, I'm going to take passionate, urgent action on these. The amount of young people we find that just will happily call themselves a climate activist when they're in their early teens, they'll live that brand, that identity year round is just phenomenal. It's happening everywhere around the world. But equally, we're finding that because, partly because of the Me Too movement, partly also because I think, there's been, this is the good thing about the gender movement is it isn't a north-south movement, it's everywhere. When you saw, Stop SARS violence in Nigeria, or you saw action for menstrual hygiene across South Africa, this is a movement that's taking young people by storm everywhere around the world. And so I think that's where we're seeing this. It's become definitely a case of those twin issues being the most igniting by far. How about you? What's your perspective?
I think it's the same, but I think it's because they're touchy-feely, right? I'm a climate activist. I see the damage of climate, but I also see the things I've been told I can do. I can get involved with adaptation. I can and we can unpack that word adaptation, and maybe it's the food system transformation and how we're going to do much more technology and producing food and getting it to the table and changing the diets. It's very real, and you can feel what you can do. Yes. And then you can say, well, that actually has and makes a difference in the lives of women and girls. And that becomes an outcome of these so many things that we want to do. Well, in the UN, we've seen much more women's leadership in decision making, in leading our agencies. That's had a difference to the kind of ideas that we've brought to the table.
That's awesome.
And what we've seen with young people, I mean, to your point that they have become so much more engaged, we've given them some kind of hook, I think, with the SDGs, and being able to find one that actually hits many of the goals. So if you take up climate action, it will do many things for pollution. So your life on land, underwater, it'll do the lot. And we've seen at the Transforming Education Summit, 70% of the people walked in the room were young.
Yeah,
and they were making demands. You didn't have to ask them. They had a declaration, and they were saying that goes on the table in the final. They're creating a movement afterwards. The same thing for the Africa business initiative that we pulled together. It was young people in the room.
Yeah, I've got to say, I love that. Well done.
It was
brilliant.
Well, lastminute.com, but it happened. And I think that's what find the ideas and listen to them. And in a number of cases, we give them the agenda.
Right.
I think we've stopped saying, let's prepare the agenda and invite youth. It's to say, you've got 3 hours, what do you want to do with it? And then they'll say, well, actually, we need 6.
Yeah.
Okay, they've negotiated, and they put their stuff on the table. So I see an intergenerational transition coming now, in that we're able to work better together for it. But look, we've gone halfway through. Next year will be a big stock take of the SDGs.
Right.
And so here on in, this drumbeat that has got to roll for us to get the SDGs back on track, because they have been knocked off by the various crises. We have to mobilize. How do you think we could mobilize 1 billion people in the next year to hit actions that would be demonstrated as moving the needle when we come to do a stock take in September next year?
Well, I often think that the way to mobilize at scale is, it's important to think about mobilization in a couple of different ways. You've got the traditional broadcast platforms, and if you can get, and by the way, it happens very rarely, happens only in very rare moments of crisis, like COVID-19. In fact, the example I gave earlier of One World Together at Home was the only global broadcast that was seen in both China, Russia, and the United States during the pandemic. The only one. And so it's extremely hard to reach all corners of the planet at once, but you can through those key moments. So I think there's an opportunity next year, under the UN mandate, to go to every nation all at once and get all the broadcasters involved. That's the first way. The second way, which is more long-term, is the platform approach. And the platform approach says to Facebook and to Twitter and to TikTok, who are themselves having existential crises right now, because People are blaming them because not just the attention economy, but the effect they're having on creating an echo chamber of information. And often that information isn't good information. And so they need actually to work closer with Global Citizen, closer with the United Nations on actually helping, how do you leverage either their platforms or they create a parallel platform that has a much bigger impact on actually getting out the right information. Now, historically, when young entrepreneurs have tried to create a parallel platform, it's always failed. Why? Because it's extremely hard to change people's existing habits. You know, if you're already on Instagram, the chances of you adopting Snapchat are limited, right? If that's your home. And so the better way to do it is to say to those platforms, and you've got to negotiate at arm's length, how do you actually get enough people to register either through a third-party app or in a way that actually integrates with their platform? And so most people, because everyone likes to say, let's create the Facebook for social good, it doesn't really work like that. You know, even Tim Hughes, who founded Facebook with Mark Zuckerberg, put hundreds of millions of dollars of his own money into this platform and it fell over for that reason. Causes on Facebook fell over, same reason. And so I would say, let's go for a broadcast, but let's negotiate with the platforms. And then you can get 1 billion people because you can't, I mean, obviously Facebook's one of the only platforms on the whole planet that has over 1 billion users alongside Alibaba's and Tencent's platforms as well. But to get that sort of scale, you have to negotiate with the platforms at arm's length. We can do it. And I think that's really, we had this fascinating conversation at the Global Citizen Board a few days ago about how the next phase of our growth could involve that sort of approach.
It's going to be really important because we still go out and you put a mic in front of someone and say, how about the SDGs or the global goals? And there's a blank look. So how to socialize more what these mean in everyday lives and how they can create their own movements in their countries to move this. You look at 3 points. You look at Africa at 1.3 billion, India just over 1 billion, and China. And between that, you would find if you got the right issue and followership, that would be it. You would ignite it.
Exactly.
But there are so many other places in the world where you want to get to because we have that leave no one behind. And when we get to the SDGs halfway through next year, it will be about, so how many girls did we get into school and how many boys did we leave behind?
Right.
How many of those that were pushed into poverty did we find a way to leapfrog and get them back in again because they could become entrepreneurial and go onto a platform online and begin their businesses? So bringing the doings that happen in Global Citizen, how do you think that we can amplify the inspiration from those actions that are done into a place where people can then multiply them, the scale at which we have to go? So not just the people on board, but the scale of the activities that now become the transformation and transition to a renewable energy piece.
Yeah. So there's kind of 2 parts, I think, to this question. The second part I'll start with first is really just about how do activists' ideas go to scale? The first part to your question is kind of a messaging question, which is, you know, Richard Curtis, who we both work closely with, has done so much work with you on making the goals famous, right? And so I guess the question comes, do you want the goals themselves to be famous, or do you want the issue areas that the goals represent to be famous? Because both those things are slightly different. And then I think the second part of it is, okay, so let's take, I think climate is probably the best example because it affects everyone in equal measure. We found when we worked with a group of young activists in South Africa on It's Bloody Time campaign, it was focused around menstrual hygiene issues. You know, when you find, it happens very rarely, but you get this moment where you get a group of passionate young activists, you lend them your platform. In this case, we gave them the Global Citizen platform. We got Beyonce attached to it. It was this perfect storm. And then we were able to get so many phone calls through to Cyril Ramaphosa's office. He had to unplug the phones from, you know, he wasn't even able to use the South African phone lines anymore.
Minister of Health talked about it.
Exactly. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to do on climate change. I think that for too often, activists like to think that their job ends at pointing the finger. You know, you're not doing X, you're not doing Y, that's enough. That's nowhere near enough. I would call that more an act of self-righteousness rather than being an effective activist. I think the true activism comes where you move the decision maker, like what Mandela did. He moved the decision maker who fundamentally disagreed with him to be forced into a position. He did it both peacefully and through some forms of violence that didn't harm others. He chose to use violence that disrupted the economy of South Africa to make it ungovernable. That was his approach. And I think, you know, there are rooms for all types of protest. But my view is that we haven't done enough to hold world leaders accountable to the promises that they've already made under Paris.
Yeah.
So take US, for example. If it truly is an issue of a few congressmen blocking $11 billion in additional climate financing, that's actually highly targetable. We can find those members of Congress, we can all spend time in their states, and we can change their policies. That's where I would spend time as a climate activist, and I would take the same approach globally.
To many, many leaders, and many of them have to make choices. And we did this with climate when we were going after mitigation. So who are the emitters?
Right.
They're all in the G20, 83% of them. And, you know, even within that, so who's doing 30%, who's doing 10%, who's doing 5%?
Exactly.
And you go after them, and you have those movements that and public mobilization that can do that. To your question of issues versus the goals, it is about the issues that deliver on the goals.
Exactly.
And if we can do that, and we can say that in 2023 from today, we moved on these issues of climate, of gender, of jobs, and we can report on that and say this is how the goals met their targets.
Exactly.
And these are the indicators we used, and we can prove it, that lives were changed. But, well, Hugh, thank you very much. I know that we are, this is to be continued. In a couple of days, we will invade.
You're going to be with 60,000 people.
We're going to invade people in Central Park yet again, which is always a delight. And just thank you for what you're doing. And it's amazing, and we are mobilizing, and people are feeling it. And the SDG moment is here again.
Thank you so much, Amina.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.